Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting our students to learn what we teach. And I am Rob Alvarez. I'm the founder of Professor Game and professor of gamification and games-based solutions at IE Business School, EFMD, EBS University, and many other places around the world. And if this content is for you, then please go ahead and subscribe to our email list for free at professorgame.com/subscribe.
Hey, engagers, and welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And we have Sarah back with us today. Sarah, once again, we need to know, are you today prepared to engage?
I certainly am. Thank you, Rob.
Let's do this because Sarah, Le-Fevre, I always get this one wrong.
Le-Fevre.
Le-Fevre is definitely a person who's been around the gamification, game-based learning, and ludogogy world for quite a while with her magazine, Ludogogy, by that name, in fact. But today we're going to be talking about something different. This is going to be a special interview. If you want to know, of course, the favorite failure of Sarah, one of her, what her thinking process looks like, what is her favorite game, and all these typical things that we always ask our guests, you can definitely find all of that on her first episode, which is episode 154. It was a while ago, almost 100, a bit over 100 episodes back. So, if you want to check that out, definitely welcome to see all of that there. Today, we will be talking about an up-and-coming Kickstarter campaign Sarah is kicking off. So, before I say anything, can you give us a gist of what this is all about?
Yes, so I've created a deck of cards called the Museum of Impossible Objects, which is a tool for storytellers, facilitators and educators. And what I'm looking to do, it already exists in electronic form and it's on a couple of platforms, including the really wonderful Deckable, which is like Audible, but for card decks. But what I'm looking to do now is to actually have the cards in a physical form. So I'm looking to do a print run to get some beautiful tarot-sized cards inside a beautiful rigid box to be able to give out to people to use in their practice. That's basically the gist of it.
Amazing. So the objective is to be able to have those cards which are already working, right? They're already out there in the world, they're doing good stuff, but to actually bring them from the digital world to the physical world. And there is much to be said about that topic. I don't know if we want to get started on that one or not, Sarah. I mean, at least for me, the pandemic has changed so many things, right? So a lot of digital stuff came up, which is amazing. I'm happy about plenty of advances that we did as humankind in general. However, after all these things have happened, there is sort of a strong pull towards, again, some of the physical stuff. Would you say that's the case for you?
Definitely. And I think with the cards, since I made them and sort of created them in digital form, I've had this real yen to hold them in my hand. Particularly with cards, I think, and card decks, that whole experience of taking them in your hands and spreading them out on a table and being able to configure them in different ways and connect them with each other and separate them from each other, and all of that sort of tactile experience is so important, I think. So the time is right now to give them a physical reality, I think.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And as I was mentioning, I think so many things are sort of coming back. I don't know. I mean, of course, it definitely will have some to do with my own experience in all of this, but I am convinced that there is, there is and there will continue to be a lot of pull into that direction. It's interesting. I have some students from the bachelor degree at the university, and some of them started the university the year where we had, all this online, right? So we had to change a bunch of things. So it was kind of, for them, it was the normal, was to have this online stuff and to do everything async and all that. But it's been a very big shift in that sense, which is a good thing in many ways. And of course, it also makes sense for them to be able to have this different experience. So bringing them back into the physical world and showing them that their university experience can also have a lot of physical components, that there is a lot of experiences to be had, I think has been really, really important for that. And I think, what you're doing with your Kickstarter campaign is very interesting because you're taking these tools from the digital world and bringing them into the physical world. And of course, as you mentioned, you had a yearn to sort of hold those cards in your hands. But what would you say is, in your specific case, that what you're building, what is the added value of having these cards in a physical format?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, that whole experience of actually manipulating them, and particularly with cards, being able to sort of turn them over, connect them with each other, put them on top of each other, position them in different ways to kind of connect the ideas on the cards. Because these cards, as I'll tell you shortly when we start talking about what's actually on them, they're very ideas rich. And one of the principal kind of uses for them, I think, will be ideation and innovation, certainly from a facilitator's perspective. And that idea of pushing ideas together can be quite a physical thing if you've actually got the physical ideas, you've got some kind of physical representation of the ideas. And I think that's a really, really powerful way of working with these kinds of things, which is why I've always been really, really into cards and card decks. I think they have that kind of presence and that kind of magic about them, regardless of what's on them.
I would definitely have to say big yes to that. I've, with gamification creation cards, which I have a few decks of. The ones that I can definitely remember off the top of my head are Ann Coppens's and Angie Marchevsky's and Bernardo Le-Fevre's cards that he gave. I've been using them for quite a while. The experience of having them right there and seeing them and shuffling them, it does make a big difference, and it helps. I mean, when the COVID hit, I actually had a physical format workshop, and I was about to deliver it to this organization, which now we've done it for many years online, and it's been amazing. Don't get me wrong, I've really enjoyed that format as well. But there is a thing to be said about, sitting people in the same room and having, cards and having sticky notes and having all the jazz that you see on the typical things when you do workshops that people think of, having, again, the sticky notes, the big sheets of paper and all that. There is something to be said about the energy in the room and the capabilities that are being built versus having a call, which, again, there is a lot of things that, online allows you to do that the physical world does not. But it goes both ways, that there's limitations to each of these mediums for sure.
Yeah, and one thing I probably should mention with that in mind is waxing lyrical about how wonderful the physical manifestation of the cards will be, is that, as I said, the cards are currently on an app called Deckable. And as a result of sort of running the Kickstarter, I've been working a lot with Nick Kellett, who's the creator of Deckable. One of the advantages that certainly within Deckable, that digital cards have is they're not limited to just having two sides. So one of the things that will be offered on the sort of pledge levels for the Kickstarter are Deckable only exclusive cards, because we can make 5-sided cards on Deckable, which is one of the things we're going to be doing. So that's going to be quite exciting, because that gives a whole new kind of dimension to some of the cards and some of the activities that can be carried out with them as well.
That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So talk to us about a little bit more in detail about what the cards are about and what do they do and what have they helped you do throughout the years?
So there's two main sort of things to talk about the cards is, first of all, what they are and kind of where they came from and the ideas that are sort of encapsulated within them. So for a very, very long time, probably second only to my love of board games is my love of speculative fiction. So sci-fi, fantasy, fairy stories, myths, legends, and so on and so forth. And for a very, very long time, I've had an idea that I wanted to make some kind of game or card deck. It was never completely clear in my mind what it was going to be, but it was going to be some kind of activity, some kind of tool that relied on these ideas, these speculative fiction ideas. And I can sort of trace this back, this kind of fascination, if you like, to the idea that they are more than just stories, these kinds of stories, things like science fiction. I remember as a very small child, probably I must have been about 8 or 9, I used to watch Star Trek, the original series, with my dad. It was reruns, I'm not that old. And there was one episode which I remember really, really clearly. It's called Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And it was the Enterprise visited a planet, and there were 2 warring factions on the planet who were trying to destroy each other. And the Enterprise really couldn't work out, the crew of the Enterprise couldn't work out what the problem was, because these people had a shared culture. They seemed to be exactly the same as each other, but for some reason they were at war. And then it's sort of, you never see two representatives of these warring factions. You never see them together on the screen until the scene when you do. And suddenly you realise they have these bi-coloured faces. One side of the face is white and one side is black. And you realise that these two individuals, the colours are reversed on their faces. So this is enough to send them to war. And of course, this was a really, really thinly veiled kind of reference to civil rights and segregation that was going on in America at the time. But it was at that point, I think, when I realised that these were more than just stories, and that they could be used to sort of look at things in a different way. And I became really fascinated with that. And as time went on, obviously, I picked up things like George Orwell, got Animal Farm. And I became very, very interested in sort of fantasy stories, became a real fan of Angela Carter. So I've always had that kind of fascination with these kinds of stories and what they can do and how they can help us to kind of explore what it is to be human. So those bigger questions. And that's basically what this deck is. So on the face of it, what it is a deck of 52 cards, and each card is an exhibit in a very, very strange museum. So the format of the cards is, on one side, there is an image of the exhibit, and there's a label, such as you would see in a museum, sort of the white labels that are stuck next to the exhibit on the wall. And then on the other side of the card, there are a set of questions about the exhibit. And taken together, there's a few ways in which these could be used. First of all, they are very much rooted in this sort of fantasy and sci-fi world. So, for example, in the world of the museum, the only sentient species. So there are ghosts, there are fairies. They're not very sort of Victorian, frilly fairies with fluffy wings. They are very much the kind of Neil Gaiman type fairies, I would say. A bit fierce and definitely very other. So there are ghosts, there are fairies, there is magic, of course. There is technology that we don't have. So all of that sort of fantasy, sci-fi stuff is all sort of mashed together. And it allows us to ask questions in a way, ask questions about things that are real, but with that kind of psychological safety of the lens of fantasy. I'll give you an example because it's quite difficult to explain, especially when we're just talking, we haven't got pictures. So there is an exhibit called the Ghost Jar, and it's a jar and it's got some kind of mechanism inside. You can see the mechanism in the picture, and swirling around the mechanism is this kind of sort of smoky substance. And the reason that's in there is because the ghost jar is occupied. So a ghost has been trapped inside this jar. And the label sort of explains a little bit about the technology that's allowed this to happen, that it's only been since 2002 that you've been able to reliably lock ghosts up in jars because of this technology that was discovered, and it's allowed us to sort of deal with malicious hauntings. So, and then on the other side of the card, there's some questions about that. Who decides when a haunting is malicious? And there's also a question of whose ghost is in the jar. Do we have to consider the rights of the sentient dead? And you suddenly realise, okay, there's a ghost and it's locked up, but actually that ghost, it's as intelligent and as sentient as you or I. So what does that mean for that ghost being trapped inside that tiny jar? So there's all these kinds of things that you can unwrap. And to me, it's like the experience I had when I read Animal Farm. As a child, you read Animal Farm and it's a fairy story about, some animals who start to run a farm. And it's not until you read it as an adult or an older sort of teenager that you realise that actually it's about something much deeper than that. And that's the way these cards work as well. So, yeah, I feel like I'm going on a bit. So, yeah, that's what they are. So the idea behind the cards is that they can be used as simple storytelling prompts. So if you like the weird fiction genre, you can use these cards endlessly, combining them with each other or singly, as prompts for your own stories or maybe your tabletop gaming or whatever. But as an educator, they could be used as, again, to teach creative writing, but also to have these conversations. So they could be used in philosophy and ethics classes, for example. You can imagine the ghost jar could be used to spark debates about who makes up the rules, how maybe different groups of people are disproportionately affected by the rules that we have in society, and things like privilege and so on. And within a facilitation situation, the option to use these cards to think about things like diversity and inclusion, for example, But also the main thrust of them, I guess, is creativity. They are a creative tool for unlocking people's creativity.
That sounds very, very cool, very, very interesting. And sometimes especially when I'm doing workshops with educators, when I'm doing workshops with other people as well, sometimes, people are trying to find this thing that solves, like 1,000 problems, right?
Yeah.
You always, you find this tool and you want to solve everything with that tool.
And,
it's always a bit of a struggle. And, I have to show them all the successful examples and the unsuccessful examples of people who try to do everything as well. So to help understand why you actually don't want to solve everything. You just want to solve a problem. Right? There's the thing that you want to make sure that people learn. There's the thing that you want people to do this and that. So I love the fact that your cards are not, oh yeah, you can use this for anything, right? They are what they are. They are as you were mentioning, they are creative prompts. They could be prompts as well for, ethical discussions, but that's exactly what they are. They're not a solution to everythingness, right? They're a very specific thing that you created, to be able to use it for these situations, right? There's a set of situations that you have, and that's it. Maybe, and this is something that happens as well, especially when I was working with case studies at the business school, right? Maybe, you created a case for example, for marketing, and maybe, it has enough numbers so that, then the finance professor comes in and says, I want to use it as well in finance. But it's still, it's still a marketing case, right? It's a case to be used mainly in marketing. If you find another use, that is absolutely beautiful and fantastic. But having, a very clear thing, as you were discussing, I think is very, very important for any endeavor. So engagers, if you're still wondering whether you want to go specific or super broad, this is another prompt to help you make that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of sort of characteristics of the world of the museum, I guess, which make it particularly suitable for particular kinds of discussions. So again, if we look at it from a facilitation perspective, one of the things which I think is really, really important is that magic exists within this world. And there are quite a few cards that kind of bring the idea of magic and technology together. But I mentioned before that, there are various, and there's clearly some kind of, when you look at some of the exhibits, there's clearly a kind of idea that there is this uneasy kind of truce and collaboration between humans and fairies. And that also comes out in the fact that there's some bits of technology which use a combination of human technology and fairy magic and technology and so on. But all of those, and one of the things, I've been running museum visits every Tuesday for the past couple of months, and they're sort of targeted at either storytellers or facilitators or educators, so slightly different slant on each visit. And one of the exercises I ran...
Sorry, when you say visits, you're talking about the cards, right? I'm not getting that reference wrong. All right.
So cool. Yes, it's kind of like a session with the cards where I invite people, we do a Zoom call, and we go through a few sort of exercises and so on, such as they might use in their practice. So with the facilitators, we did a sort of ideation and innovation session. So we used 3 cards, which I like to think of as the technology cards. They're sort of magical technology. And there was 2 exercises we ran. The first one was, okay, we have this product on our books. This is one of the products we make in our company. What else could we make with this product? So when you've got magic, you free up your imagination, because you don't have to say, when you're ideating, you don't have to say, well, I've got to pull that idea back because we haven't got X, Y, Z, because literally anything is possible. So it gives us permission to tell these stories about what we actually want to achieve with this bit of innovation, and then we can pull it back afterwards after we've done the ideation. But another one that we used, which again was more on the ethical front, is there was, again, using the same cards. These particular cards, they represent great sort of innovative technology, but there's a slight ethical kink to each one. So one of the cards, for example, is a not carbon neutral, but actually carbon negative power solution. But it does involve imprisoning magical beings inside a glass bulb. So it's a light bulb, basically. And we have to ask whether that's ethical or not. There's another one which is about harvesting a kind of very useful and extremely expensive material from people who are asleep and dreaming, but there's a risk to the people who are asleep. So again, there's an ethical thing around that. So we did a little session where, again, we said we are making these products with our company, but we're having quite a lot of difficulty because people are complaining about the potential environmental or ethical impact of our products. So how can we change these products to make them more ethical? So all of those things, they're kind of rooted in fantasy, but they help people to have these conversations about something which might be very real in their situation, but with that kind of safe buffer that, well, with two things really. There can be this kind of psychological safety of it not actually applying to the real world situation, which can be useful in certain situations, but also the idea that your creativity is freed up by the fact that what you're actually discussing is a related but different situation from your situation of reality.
And the whole creation of a safe space is a huge part of the concept of using, simulations, of using game-based learning, of using gamification in learning, because it allows you something that I think I want to say that we've lost. I don't want to think that this is something that is entirely new, and it's that capacity to try things out, see if they work, and say, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else, right? That's not really new. That's literally, watching my daughter grow up right now. Like she's trying to do something and it doesn't. Like she grabbed like this, like a book that is made mostly out of cloth, but it has a little piece of plastic. And babies are not particularly delicate when moving their arms around, right? So she starts moving and shaking it, and suddenly she snapped her face with a piece of plastic, right? And she was upset. Of course she was upset. But then she didn't, like the same violence and the place where she was grabbing it, she didn't shove it back in her face again because she learned, right? She said, well, that was a failure. I just don't want to hit my face again. Let me try something else. I can still do my, shaking hands and shaking the whole arm around with this thing to hear the noise and all that. But this particular instance of the shaking, I'm not going to do because I don't want, any harm to come to me once again. Of course, within... Again, for kids, you have to have a safe environment. It has to be something where, even if they kind of screw up in that sense, it's not going to have a major consequence, right? And, as you grow older, that space of safety starts expanding itself, right? Because now it's physical safety mostly, right? Then, there's other types of safety, etc. But that space where you can screw up gets a lot larger. There's a lot more things that you can try and fail. And, really, 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 nothing happens. And that's difficult to sort of imbue back into our culture nowadays, at least as far as I've seen. It's really hard to get people to say, well, I tried this, it didn't work, and that's okay. So creating that safe space with your cards, I think, is something definitely commendable. But Sarah, I don't know how much time we have left, but I do want to make sure that you sort of give us more specifics on your campaign. By the time this episode launches, the campaign is not necessarily going to be live, so Sarah is going to be providing us with some links we'll put on the show notes. So if you look for Sarah, SARAH, if you look for that on Professor Game, you'll find the original episode, as I mentioned before, and you'll find this episode with the campaign for this museum, right? Yeah. When you find it there, you'll find all of the links that Sarah is mentioning. However, as I mentioned before, by the time you see this, if you just launched, the campaign might not be live, but there are things that you can do. So, Sarah, I don't want to, sort of give anything away. You have really all the details of all this.
So, yes, I'm hoping that the Kickstarter will be launching at the end of May, but all things being equal, I'm a one-woman band, so sometimes the amount of work that needs to get done might prove to be a bit prohibitive, so we'll see how it goes. But there's a few kind of calls to action, I suppose. The first one would be, I'm really looking for people to sort of, if you're interested, I have a backer kit landing page people can sign up to. There's all sorts of, outside of the actual Kickstarter itself, there's all sorts of really exciting stuff happening with the museum. I'm talking to some people about the potential of using it within school writing programs and actually creating the writing programs to go with that. The possibility it's going to be translated into Swedish, and along with that, some real life models of some of the exhibits actually going to be made and put into museums. So there's all kinds of stuff going on, and in order to keep up with all of that, and of course to keep up with when the Kickstarter launches, I have a backer kit landing page, so it'd be great if people go along there and sign up for the updates there. There's a Kickstarter pre-launch page as well, but that won't involve me communicating with you, because anybody who's run a Kickstarter will probably know that Kickstarter collects the people who are interested in knowing when the thing launches, but there's no way of the creator knowing who those people are. So not until it's launched anyway. So there's that. One of the other things that I'm doing at the moment is I'm running these, that I mentioned previously, I'm running these field trips to the museum. There are different field trips for storytellers, facilitators and educators, and there's an Eventbrite link to that. They're free trips. All the best museums don't charge you. So you can turn up to one of those to see, to have a play with the cards and see what they might do for you. And with that in mind as well, one of the other things that I'm doing is, for people who are interested, you can get a kind of cut down version of the cards. So I think it's about 20 of the cards, digital files of those, for you to play with in your practice. So, play with in your storytelling or take into your classrooms and just try them out and see how they work for you. It's kind of a free deck, but not a free lunch, because obviously I'm not looking to cannibalise my own offering. What I'm looking to do is to get feedback from people, and also have people, if they enjoy the deck, to share the word and share that with their friends and their connections, and tell them what they've used them for. So that would be, that's my calls to action, I guess, at the moment. Come and play in a tour, take them away and play, and sign up to find out about the Kickstarter.
Definitely will do. To engagers, we will have all of those links. As we were discussing, I was asking Sarah before the interview, where, should we make sure that people go to? That will be the backer kit link. It's going to be a long link. You'll see it there. It's going to be that one. That was the main place so that she can keep in contact with you. Of course, as well as she mentioned, if you go to her LinkedIn, for example, you can also connect with Sarah, ask questions, and she was offering, as well as you just saw, some tours into the museum, some guided tours showing what things are possible. And there are all sorts of things going on, and I'm sure as the Kickstarter campaign, whether it was planned beforehand or whether it came up sort of serendipitously, I'm sure many things will be happening where you can keep updated as well in that sense. So, Sarah, is there anything you want to make sure we discuss before we end the interview?
I don't think so. I think, I probably should just mention what's actually offered on the Kickstarter. That would be something to mention, wouldn't it? So obviously I've mentioned already that the main focus is getting the cards printed. But in terms of, and if you want to use the cards for your own purposes, for storytelling or for coming up with ideas for tabletop role-playing games or whatever, then that's probably the level you'll want to back at. But if you're a facilitator or an educator, one of the other things that is offered at those levels is a very comprehensive 60-plus page guide to using the cards. So what that will have in it is it will have session plans, activity plans, all sorts of ideas for games and activities to use the cards for. But also, importantly, for each card, there will be a page for each card that goes into a lot of detail about the inspirations behind the cards. So it'll have all the cultural references, all the books and films and so on that inspired that particular card, but also links to extra resources on the themes for that card. So as an example, I can give you another one. There's a card called the Necrotic Tattoo, which has a picture of a tattoo on somebody's back, but the tattoo has actually been created, with it being the Museum of Impossible Objects, it has been created in a very strange way. It's actually been created by deliberate infection with a necrotizing bacterium, which creates scars that look like tattoos. Now, obviously, this is quite dangerous. It's been outlawed in a lot of countries, but there's still places that you can go in the world. So there's a tourist trade for this rather dangerous beauty treatment. So obviously, those kinds of cards, if you were using that in a critical thinking class within a school or a university, there's obviously deep parallels there with things like Botox. How far will people go to be beautiful? What dangerous things do they do to themselves? There's all sorts of questions around body image and so on and so forth. And I've kind of forgotten where I was going with that. I knew I started that one for some reason, but I can't remember why now. Can you remember where we were before we started that?
But actually, we were looking at, what are anything else you want to make sure that we.
Oh right, yes. So I was talking
get.
about the guide. So obviously that guide will contain things like links to sort of web pages where they're discussing the pros and cons of Botox and so on and so forth. That guide will not be printed. That will be a PDF, because one of the things that I want to make sure is that with that guide that there's always an updated version of it. to sort of back up the real world links, I guess, with the themes of the cards. So it makes sense to have that as an online PDF.
Amazing. So thank you very much for sharing all of this. Thank you for putting your work out there, Sarah. This is something that, it's sometimes easy to forget that, I'm sure that this has also some form of enterprising interest in it for sure. And that, in my opinion, at least is a very good thing. But we also forget sometimes that these enterprising interests come because, you are providing a service. You're providing something to the world that wasn't there before, right? And without your cards, the world would be a different place. It would not be as good as it is, or they can be a better place in some way, shape, or form for somebody's lives, and that somebody affects other people's lives. So I want to thank you for putting these cards and creating them and putting the effort doing all of this and putting it all together and going through a Kickstarter campaign with a one-woman band, as you were mentioning before, which is a humongous effort, I am sure.
It is a bit,
still
yes.
to figure out what
that.
a Kickstarter looks like, but from everything I've heard is, yes, I'm sure it is a handful. For sure, if at the very least, it's a handful. So thanks again for all of this, for putting all that effort on your work. Definitely thank you for being and sharing with us today with the Engagers on Professor Game Podcast.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. However, we have now to say that it's game over.
Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to the Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews like this one, special interviews as well, with incredible guests like Sarah, please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. We'll be in contact and you can let me know that these are the kinds of guests you want, that these are not the kind of guests you want. Who would you like to propose perhaps? Who are you interested in? Who do you want to hear from? Or anything else as well. And of course, you would be completely updated on anything that we might have for you. And of course, as we'd like to remind you before we end our episodes, please, before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe or follow, again, for free, using your favorite podcast app to Professor Game, and then listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.